Now to what brought Trudeau to Toronto today to meet with Ontario's new Premier, Doug Ford, for the first time since the provincial election. Clashes were expected over climate policy as the two are deeply divided on the issue. But then, moments before the closed-door talks, the Ontario PC government set the stage for another fight by publicly denouncing Ottawa's handling of asylum seekers. So how did the meeting play out? The CBC's Mike Crowley was on the scene and joins us now from Queen's Park. Hey, Mike, thanks for being with us. So what happened?
Well, Vashi, this issue of immigration, illegal immigration, asylum seekers really dominated the meeting somewhat unexpectedly. It kind of got kicked off by this statement that was put out just before the Prime Minister arrived for his meeting. The tone of it from the Premier Doug Ford's spokesperson saying that the federal government encouraged illegal border crossers to come into our country. This has resulted in a housing crisis and threats to the services that Ontario families depend on. So naturally, this was one of the questions to ask the Prime Minister as soon as he came out of the meeting. He said that he and Premier Doug Ford agreed that it would be good for their officials to sit down and talk about this issue. But he says that he tried to reassure the Premier that the asylum seeker system is separate from the immigration system. Take a listen.
It didn't seem to me that the Premier was quite as aware of our international obligations to the UN Convention on Refugees as he might have been. So I spent a little time explaining how the asylum-seeking system works and how our system is supposed to operate.
And the Prime Minister says he gave those assurances to Premier Ford that it's important that the immigration system and the asylum system is working actively. Okay, Vashi?
So what is the Ford government saying in response to all of that?
The minister who's responsible for immigration, Lisa MacLeod, she came out after Cabinet, so this was after the meeting ended, and she had some fairly strong words for the Prime Minister, basically saying that if the Trudeau government wants to bring people into the country, they need to be sure that they are paid for.
The reality is we've got a Prime Minister who's created a problem with 28,000 people who illegally crossed the border into Canada and who has really only sent a few people back, but at the same time has seen a massive pressure on the largest city in the country, here in Toronto.
Now, the Mayor of Toronto has indicated that the cost to the city is somewhere in the neighborhood of $75 million. But I asked Minister MacLeod, how significant is this thing that she's calling a crisis? She said there's maybe 800 people that have come into Ontario that she would class as illegal border crossers. She says that she is looking into the cost that this is having on Ontario's social assistance system and the health system. Vashi?
Thanks, Mike. So what will the federal government do now? Pony up the cash for Ontario's refugees or try to convince the PC government that this is a shared responsibility? Joining me now is the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, Ahmed Hussen. Hi, Minister Hussen. Thanks for being with us again. We just heard the Prime Minister suggest that Premier Ford doesn't completely understand Canada's international obligations when it comes to asylum seekers. What does that mean?
First of all, it's important to note that, as the Prime Minister has stated, that it is really important to understand that Canadians expect all levels of government to work together on issues. We may not agree on everything, but we are expected to work together on issues that face our country. On the issue of housing, it's a shared responsibility. On the issue of immigration, we have a great immigration system in this country. Asylum seekers we have international obligations as well as domestic laws to apply when it comes to asylum seekers. These are not optional issues. This is the law that we can't just opt out of. And so once someone is on Canadian soil and they claim asylum, we have international obligations to provide them due process to make sure that their claims are at least heard. Once they're here, The provision of housing is a shared responsibility. We understand the pressures that provinces have faced with respect to this issue, even though in the last number of months the numbers have been dropping and the numbers are promising. The federal government has stepped up. We have invested more than $173 million in budget 2018 for more border security operations, as well as faster processing of refugee claims. In addition to that, we have made an initial allocation of $50 million in recognition of the pressures that Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba have faced with respect to this issue. But we have to work together. And as we have worked very closely with Quebec, we also need Ontario to be part of the mix.
But what Ontario, I think what Premier Ford's government is saying today is, okay, fine, housing is a shared responsibility, but they're saying the reason there is this influx of asylum seekers that they have to deal with is because of the federal government. And because, you know, they're even going so far as to say it's because of that tweet sent out by the Prime Minister that said, to those fleeing persecution, war, Ontario, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. So they're saying, you created this problem, you have to pay for it. Do they have a point?
I think it's important to note that Canada is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions when it comes to asylum seekers. We have an asylum system that makes sure that once someone is on Canadian soil, we have a legal obligation. It's the law. It's not an option. It's the law that we have to, at the very minimum, allow them a fair hearing to make their claim. Now, if they do not require Canada's protection, if they're not genuine refugees, then they get to be removed from Canada.
Except fewer than 1% of the 28,000 people who have crossed illegally into this country have actually been removed.
The issue is that we have to give due process. These are not optional things. They are international obligations that we have signed on to as a country. Having said that, Canadians expect all levels of government to work together on a broad number of issues, including this one. We recognize the pressures that this has created on cities and provinces. And I'll give you an example of the model that we're working on. Quebec and Canada have had a good model to work together on with respect to the identification of temporary housing sites and making sure that there's an orderly system in place. The fact of the matter is some people will find themselves in Ontario, and we need Ontario to be at the table to work together to make sure that we have a system in place to relieve pressure from Toronto. Minister MacLeod has been on the record as stating that she's concerned about the pressure that this has created on the temporary housing sites in Toronto. Well, one of the ways to do that is one of the ways to relieve that pressure is for Ontario to work with the federal government and Toronto to establish a system where we identify temporary housing sites outside of Toronto, the same way that we're doing with Quebec. And we're ready to play our role. We've increased our capacity at the border. We're making the necessary investments in the refugee determination process to speed up decisions. And we're there with the provinces to make sure we help them with these extraordinary pressures.
But on that issue, there is a very tangible manifestation of that in Toronto right now. The shelters there are made up, right now 40% of them are filled with refugees and asylum claimants. 800 of those people, many of whom are children, will need shelter after August 9th when 2 college dormitories need to actually be used for school again. We had the mayor on last week, and he was saying he's asked the federal government for help. Will you help them?
Absolutely, and we have been. I have been in touch with Mayor. I've been in touch with Mayor Tory on numerous occasions. We're working very closely together. I understand the pressures that they're facing. We've already made an allocation of $50 million. We are committed to flowing that money before the end of this month.
Will that make the difference? Will that allow Toronto to move those refugees out of those dormitories?
It's part of the. It's part of the solution, absolutely. But in addition to that, we are working with Quebec, but we also need to work with Ontario to set up a triage system so that cities like Toronto and Montreal do not face the disproportionate pressure that they're facing.
Is that possible, though? I ask you because with what Mr. Premier Ford said today, is that even possible? How can you work together when he says he doesn't want anything to do?
Well, ideally, it is possible if we have two choices. We either have a situation where, for example, with the work that we're doing with Quebec, where a province is able to identify the necessary sites, that we're able to share information, that we're able to coordinate our responses and have an orderly process while these asylum seekers wait for their hearings, which we're speeding up by making the necessary investments in the IRB, or we don't have that coordination and we have a less orderly situation, which I don't believe Ontario also would like. So Toronto and the Government of Canada is on the same page on this. We're working together. The federal government has stepped forward, not only with financial resources, but with more capacity at the border, but also with faster processing. But we need Ontario to be part of the solution, and that is what Canadians expect of us.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot for your time, Minister Huson.
Thank you very much.